For me personally, I see reading Indigenous as a decolonizing act. Whether it's about intergenerational trauma, speculative futures, colonization, resilience, family, or just everyday joy, books by Indigenous authors bring perspectives that are not part of many of our lived experience, and it can't be found anywhere else.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Corene from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
We are going to be talking about Indigenous authors. So I did want to flush that out a little bit. Indigenous or First People in Canada include First Nations people, Métis, and Inuit people. Of course, there are Indigenous people literally all over the world. You might know Maori in New Zealand, Indigenous Australians, Sami in Northern Europe, or any of the many other Indigenous groups all over the world. But Indigenous identity is not limited to authors with a status card. The best way to find out if an author is Indigenous is to see how they identify. So I like to make sure that I always read the bio before I read the book. For me personally, I see reading Indigenous as a decolonizing act. Whether it's about intergenerational trauma, speculative futures, colonization, resilience, family, or just everyday joy, books by Indigenous authors bring perspectives that are not part of many of our lived experience, and it can't be found anywhere else. Historically, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis voices have not always been given the space in the publishing industry, and their stories have been told by other people. So I think taking the time to read books by Indigenous authors puts their story back in their hands, and it's really important. And this is a topic that I know we were, I think, universally pretty excited to talk about, all of us, so we can agree on that, which is exciting. And we are going to start with Liz's book.
Great. Thanks, Fiona. And that was really well said. So thank you for acknowledging that, and such a great introduction to, yes, a topic that we're all very excited to talk about today, which are Indigenous authors. And so for my pick today, I chose a book by an author that may already be well known to a lot of you. And that is Starlight by Richard Wagamese. So I'd never read any Richard Wagamese prior to this, but the beautiful cover did draw me in, and also the wonderful reviews. Sadly, this was the last book published by Richard Wagamese. It was actually published posthumously, and he did not have the opportunity to finish the book prior to his death. But fear not, fortunately, his editor was able to craft somewhat of a denouement to the end of the book, which, although it's bittersweet because you feel like it was such a beautiful, at least I felt like it was such a beautiful book. I did feel as though the editor did do justice in taking Wagamese's voice, who they were very familiar with, and wrapping things up, as well as providing a beautiful tribute at the end to the author. So this book, for those of you who are familiar with Wagamese's works, it can be considered sort of the book that comes after in a chronology to Medicine Walk. So the primary character of this book, his name is Frank Starlight. You have read Medicine Walk, then you'll recognize that name, because in that book, Frank was a 16-year-old boy who had returned home to his father. And so in this book, in Starlight, Frank is an older man now who has inherited his father's farm, and he lives a very quiet and dignified life in his small community. So not only is he a man of the earth in terms of farming and ranching, and also working with his hands, but he is also very in tune with the world, the natural world around him. And one of the ways he likes to unwind is to commune with nature at night. And in his area, this book takes place in northern BC. He likes to go into the woods at night with his camera and look out for wolves. So he'll go running through the woods in search of these beautiful creatures that he enjoys taking photographs of. Now, although Frank lives a very quiet and unassuming life and mostly keeps to himself, into town come a woman named Emmy and her very young daughter. Now, these two happen to be on the run from Emmy's abusive ex. They did not part on good terms. And so now she is doing whatever she can to ensure that her and her daughter are safe. So they end up in this small town in which Frank lives, and she's hoping to shelter Emmy there. Now, because they ran away and are on the run, they don't have a lot of resources available to them. And unfortunately, in this small town where they stick out because everybody knows one another, they get caught shoplifting so that the two have something to eat. That's why they went to the store and tried to smuggle out some food. So Emmy is at risk of losing her daughter, unfortunately. And this is where Frank happens to step in. So he decides to take in Emmy and her daughter so that they have a safe place to live. And over time, the two earn each other's trust and get to come to an understanding about each other. And what develops is a really understated but beautiful story about human relationships, how the world around us can influence our behaviors, our character, and also our relationships with each other. It was an incredibly beautifully written book. I wouldn't call it sparse, but I found Wagamizi's style to not have a lot of embellishment, which I really appreciate. So it was bittersweet to remind myself that sadly this was Wagamizi's last work. However, I do really look forward to going into the backlist for Richard Wagamizi and catching up on all the other wonderful books that I've missed.
That's great. Thanks, Liz. Yeah, he was quite prolific, right? Like he has quite a few books. All right, Corene, you are up.
I feel like I'm on a bit of like a nonfiction kick. And again, using my strategy, if I want to explain something, I go to children's books first and then kind of go out from there. And so a book that came out, I feel like last year, is an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States for Young People. So this is an adaptation of the original text by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who has been working with the National Indigenous Movement for about 4 decades. And it was adapted by two very distinguished writers, Dr. Debbie Reese, who is tribally enrolled at Nambe Pueblo. She is also the author of the American Indians in Children's Literature blog, which is kind of required reading for anyone who is interested in children's literature and the depiction of First Nations people. And Jen Mendoza, who is a curriculum specialist and who married into a Creek family. So they took the original text, which was meant for adults. It's part of a series called Revisioning History. So it takes what is the narrative of American history and examines it from different, often marginalized points of view. And what I really, really liked about this book is that it really challenges that fairy tale that we share with the United States, that the settling or colonization was this kind of easy, foretold process, that the land was empty, that it was easy to walk into. And what I think this book does a really good job of is kind of showing how massive the civilization was in North America, how massive and accomplished and varied and different and interconnected, and in order to settle it, how history has had to kind of spin that to make it okay for settlers to take the land from them. So it's part of like the systematic dehumanization and erasure of the history there, so that you're able to kind of perpetuate that myth. And so what I think this book does a really good job of is kind of challenging all the narratives about the history of the United States as well as the history of Canada, because it uses much as the same strategies. It's kind of written almost like a little, like a textbook, like how you would approach a history of Canada or a history of the United States, but instead it's looking at the history of Indigenous people in the United States. So what I really like is that it'll give you kind of a section of history, and then it'll give you questions afterwards to think about, or to challenge your thinking about certain things and why you think that they are the way that they are. So in addition to talking about things like Columbus, why is Columbus important? Why is it okay to celebrate someone like this? They take on different things like sports teams with racist names. Why is that okay? And really get you thinking about things in a way that, if you are from a settler heritage, haven't really had to consider that perspective. So I love that it is a history. So it really does chronicle that whole history from pre-contact up to Standing Rock. So it traces that line of resiliency, that line of strong leadership, of people constantly fighting against that narrative and fighting against white supremacy. And it takes it all the way up to kind of current day. And I love that it has those extra questions that really get you thinking and challenging your own widely held beliefs, because the history that we have been taught often is a fairy tale that benefits a certain group of people. And so books like this are so important to challenge us and to see what really happened beneath the surface and why. So I really encourage, if you're looking for a great book for middle schoolers or for high schoolers to start looking at Indigenous history, this is a good one to start with.
Sounds like a really important book. Like you were saying, Corene, with the focus on resilience, that's something that I really like about Indigenous literature. Is I feel that's often a focus, and while there's always discussions of very difficult topics, it's really these books are proof of resilience. So the book that I chose was A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. And Alicia Elliott is a Tuscarora writer who moved to Six Nations Grand River Reserve when she was 13. And this book is a collection of autobiographical essays on trauma, colonial legacies, identity, and family. And I actually listened to the audiobook version, which is narrated by the author. And I would definitely recommend it, because it was very powerful to have her essays come from her own voice. And it's definitely a book that I want to read again, like maybe listen to it again and then read it again and then buy it so that it's there and I can look things up every time I think about it. Like, I just don't feel like I was able to absorb the complexity of it the first time. And I actually find it's a very difficult book to talk about, to find the right words, because it's just, it was amazing. But not necessarily in like a way where I can say specifically, this is what she talked about, because she talked about so much. So in the title essay, she talks about her young teen years, living on the res in a 2-bedroom trailer with a family of 7. She explores mental illness that her mother went through and her own dehumanizing experience with therapy. Throughout the book, she really centers the conflict in her life created by having a Haudenosaunee father and a white Catholic mother, and how in herself, with that mixed heritage, she became both the oppressor and the oppressed. She talks about before having her first child, while she was pregnant, she has this moment of wishing that her child has blue eyes and light skin so that they'll have an easier life. Well, at the same time, in her life, she's also trying to reclaim her language, her Tuscarora language, and her culture. And just that her life is constantly filled with these contradictions, these things that don't seem to fit together. But she doesn't tiptoe around the fact that that is a cause of colonialism. And I really appreciate that she doesn't internalize that blame, that she's able to call that out. And I think it's a really powerful part of the book, part of the essays. The book is really resilient and beautiful. And although it's not the meaning of the title of the book, I really felt like I was observing a mind spread out on the ground. She really lets you into her thoughts fully and doesn't back away when those thoughts are conflicting or confusing. And like, she's just such an amazing, beautiful writer. I don't have the words to recreate like how she writes, but I definitely encourage you even to. I think some of her essays are available online, like even to like just check out one of her essays and see if you enjoy her writing style, because uh, it was a big turning point for me in my reading of just recognizing how much I appreciate authors who let you into their mind in that way. Yeah, so I enjoyed it a lot. Right. So I think Virginia is going to talk next. I'm very excited to hear about this book.
Well, I'm glad you're excited. I'm pretty excited about this book. And I have to thank Liz for recommending this book to me. I think earlier we talked about how the publishing industry could really do a better job in publishing own voices books. And I was talking to Liz about how few I was able to find in the genres that I usually read. Like, I'm a big speculative fiction fan, so fantasy, science fiction, horror are the genres I usually read. So I was kind of having a hard time finding books by Indigenous authors in those genres. So Liz suggested this book to me, and good choice, Liz. Thank you again. So the book that I read for this category is Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabgishik Rice. The author is also a CBC host, and he does the Up North show in Northern Ontario. And he divides his time between Sudbury and the Waksaksing First Nation, where this book is set. So this is a dystopian novel, so a word of warning here that some of the things you're going to read about may be a bit too similar to what we are experiencing right now. So if you are not quite ready to read about a dystopian world, save it for later. It is a really good book, so read that later. So the book opens with Evan, who is out hunting and getting ready for winter. Now, in the Waksaksing First Nations, they do have like a lot of the modern conveniences, like picking up food from a grocery store and, TV, cell phones and all of that. But they're also taught to be self-sufficient and continue sort of their way of life of the Anishinaabe people. So most of the people in the community will go out hunting just before winter to ensure that there is enough food for the family. And not just for your own family, but also others in the community, because you take care of each other. So here's Evan, he just caught a moose and he's packing up and ready to go home. And when he got home, he realized that it was eerily quiet. And then he noticed, oh, right, the TV is off. Why is the TV off? Like, it's always on around this time. So that was a little strange. And his partner, Nicole, came out to say that they actually haven't had a satellite signal all day, which is not unusual, annoying, but not unusual, especially in the winter and right now there's like a big snowstorm going on outside. So yeah, that's not unusual that they could lose a signal. They figure it's going to come back tomorrow. They woke up tomorrow, the next day, and they noticed that the clock is off. And then the fridge is not working. And it seems like they have lost power entirely. And again, not too unusual. And, they're not too concerned yet. It is winter after all. But after a few days of no power, people are starting to get a little antsy. And the local grocery store is pretty much like out of food, because people are starting to stock up. The phone lines are dead, and so they couldn't really contact Hydro to find out what's going on and when power will be restored. So to calm people down, the council meets and they talk about like measures to make sure everyone is taken care of. Maybe they need to start doing inventories of what people have. They are thinking about like, let's get the generator going to make sure that the food that we have are not spoiled. And they're going to start asking people to conserve energy to make sure they can last a few weeks at least. They do have a delivery of diesel coming, but again, with this non-stop snowstorm, like who knows whether they will get supply and when they will get it. So they want to make sure that they're prepared, at least for a few weeks. And then one day they were out there like plowing snow and clearing off the roads, and they noticed two vehicles approaching. And it turns out they were two youths that have gone to a nearby town to go to college. And when they showed up, they were in tears. They were so glad to manage to find their way back home. And then they told them what happened outside. It is not just here, but apparently there is a blackout everywhere. And it's just chaos out there. The school said, stay put, stay in the dorm. But they realized they really should get out now, because things are getting ugly out there. And so they stole 2 snowmobiles and they left the school while they still can. So now they know no supplies is coming for a long, long time, and they have to figure out like how they can keep each other safe. So what else can they do? So they're gonna have to get everybody together and to figure this out. And of course, while they were planning for the snowstorm, another visitor showed up, and this time it's an outsider that is going to bring chaos to them. As mentioned, this is a dystopian novel, so what's happening in the story is bleak, is awful. But I have to say, as a reader, I feel like a warmth that kind of protects me from the cold and the snowstorm and all the dire things that happen in the book. It definitely have to do with the closely knit community, especially Evan's family. They're just so loving and they're like such a functional family, which is so nice to see in a dystopian novel. And you feel protected by them, and you feel that like the way of life, the way they take care of each other, they're going to come out okay. At least it really feels like that. So, and there are definitely horrible people out there and horrible things. And people have done some very horrible things to survive in the book. But it's not hopeless, which is really a nice sort of change of pace when you're looking at a dystopian novel. And in the book also, you get a chance to learn about the Anishinaabe people and sort of their way of life, their values. And the author weaves in these details and these aspects like into the story in a very sort of very natural way. Like they don't feel forced or didactic, so you're getting a really, really good apocalyptic story, but you're also getting a really good introduction to the Waksaksing First Nations. And so it's a story that I really appreciate. And as I was like reading more about the book, I find out that there's actually going to be a second book coming out, and he's got a publishing deal already for it. He hasn't written it yet, but it's coming. So I'm looking forward to reading that. So again, this book is called Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabgishik Rice.
All right. Looks like we've got one more left. Sadie.
Okay. So I'm actually going to also talk about a dystopian novel, which is not usually my genre. It is not the kind of book that I tend to kind of move towards. But I am going to talk about The Marrow Thieves. And this is by Métis author Cherie Demeline. And Cherie is from the Georgian Bay Métis community in Ontario. And I just want to start off actually with a quote from Cherie, kind of looking at the difference between what she would like to be identified as and recognized as a writer. So she says, "I would love to be recognized as a writer of Indigenous stories. I'm not a Canadian writer. This is what is now known as Canada. It means something different to and for me." So that quote was actually quite powerful to me. To kind of hear that she is an Indigenous writer. She's not a Canadian writer. But The Marrow Thieves, it does take place in what is now known as Canada, and it actually takes place in a future world, and it is set in a dystopian future. And in this future, the world that we know has been destroyed, and it's been destroyed by pollution. It's been destroyed by global warming, climate change, coastal cities have crumbled into the ocean, natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes, they've destroyed communities. And as an effect of all of these horrific events and the trauma that people have gone through, most people have lost the ability to dream. Now, the exception to this is the Indigenous peoples of North America, and they continue to dream, and they carry the ability to dream in the marrow of their bones. Now, because of this ability, the Indigenous peoples are hunted to extract the marrow of their bones and have it turned into a serum that those who do not have this ability, mainly white people, can use to gain the ability to dream back. So that's sort of the premise of the world, the premise of the story. Definitely seems a very dark world, a world that I think is very easy to imagine. And I say that I recognize how hard that might be for some people to hear, but I think that it is a world that, looking at the way our world is now, it is easy to see how we could get to this world. So the story begins with two brothers, Francis, or Frenchie, and Mitch. Their parents have been lost to what are called schools. Now, these schools are where people are taken to have their bone marrow extracted. And these schools are very strongly based on the residential schools. They've taken that idea and they have brought it back and turned it into these centers where they take Indigenous people to extract their bone marrow from them. So they've lost both of their parents to these schools and they are now on their own. So they are hiding in a treehouse, and Mitch has just found a bag of Doritos, and they're both very excited about this. But when they open the bag of Doritos and start eating it, they are discovered by a group of recruiters. Recruiters are the people who go around searching for Indigenous peoples and taking them to the schools. So in order to save his younger brother's life, Mitch sacrifices himself, allowing Frenchie to get away. We now shoot ahead about 5 years later. Frenchie is 15 years old. Frenchie is a Métis boy. He has now lost his whole family to the schools. So after his brother is taken, Frenchie is taken in by a group who are hiding and traveling north. It is said that the north is safer. It is said that the Indigenous communities in the north have found a way to survive and have recreated the communities that were lost in other parts of the country. So the group is led by an Anishinaabe man named Miigwans, and this group kind of becomes Frenchie's found family on this journey. So as the story goes on, him and his family continue to journey north. You learn about each of the people in the group. You learn their coming to story, which is sort of how they found their way to this group, what their path was, what their journey was to find the group together. Now, as I mentioned, I don't tend to read a lot of dystopian fiction, but I found that, similar to what Virginia was saying, well, on the surface, this was a very dystopian story. It was a story of survival. The majority of it really focuses on the characters, the family, the relationships that they have with each other, the history that they have as well. It focuses on the lost languages of the Indigenous people and how they are trying to find their community again, how they're trying to rebuild that language, how they're trying to rebuild the stories and the histories that have now been lost. And it's similar to what Virginia said. It is actually, I found, an uplifting story. It was definitely a tearjerker. I'm finding, Corene, that I might be closer to you, where I do tend to cry at more books than I thought that I did. But for different reasons, I think. So it was not super sad. The ending does kind of uplift you, which is wonderful. The characters are so strong. There's kind of playfulness to it. Frenchie, there's a young woman, Rose, who comes into their group who Frenchie has a crush on. So you kind of experience that teenage crush and a bit of romance as well, and kind of navigating that whole thing. But it was a very powerful book. It was a very interesting and compelling book, and I would recommend it 100%.
Fantastic. And a Canada Reads book, if I remember.
It is, yes. Yeah, 2018 Canada Reads selection. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you on behalf of everyone for this little book chat. Enjoy your reading.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.